On May 5, 2006, a plane took off from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, with 5 men shackled inside. The men landed here at this airport in southern Europe. They were given a new set of clothes, but little information.
There were 20 to 30 soldiers inside the plane. Our hands and feet were tied by chains. The first thing we saw was darkness.
The men were members of a Muslim ethnic minority group from Western China called the Uighurs. But they now found themselves driven through the streets of a city that most of them had never heard of.
At that moment, we thought, they lied to us. We were very afraid.
It turned out the Uighurs had been taken to Tirana, Albania. This past summer, we arrived to track them down. We first found Abu Bakker Qassim. He led us to the building where he and the others had been taken after they arrived. He began to tell us the Uighurs' story.
When I first arrived, they brought me to this place behind me. It is the political asylum center of Albania. We arrived at about midnight. I spent 1.5 years of my life here.
When the local news heard about the arrival of Abu Bakker and his friends at the refugee center, they staked them out. People were worried that these men were Al-Qaeda terrorists. Under scrutiny, Abu Bakker and the others struggled to make sense of it all.
Getting caught up in international terrorism, being taken to Guantanamo, then becoming the focus of the world as an evil person, this was beyond my wildest thoughts. It was a punishment of destiny that we went through.
The story of the Uighurs' unimaginable odyssey began in an even more unlikely place. This is Xinjiang, a remote area of western China where Abu Bakker and the others grew up. Bordering Central Asia along the old Silk Road, the Uighurs consider this their homeland and struggle with Chinese rule. The long-standing tension between this Muslim minority and the Chinese government dominates daily life. Here in Xinjiang, Abu Bakker made a living as a leather worker, and at age 26, he married.
I had love. I had a family. Our life was beautiful. Now it's devastated.
Abu Bakker's big move came in mid-2000. He says he headed out of Xinjiang looking for work. Leaving was bittersweet. His wife was now pregnant. He told her he'd be back in 6 months. But the trip didn't go as planned. From his home in Xinjiang, Abu Bakker headed southwest. Running low on money, he stopped in a Uighur village in Afghanistan. It was a decision that left him in one of the worst spots in the world after the 9/11 attacks. The U.S. had just begun bombing the Al-Qaeda stronghold in Tora Bora, where Abu Bakker had been staying. In the confusion that followed, U.S. forces pursued hundreds of Al-Qaeda suspects who fled the bombings. Cash bounties offered by U.S. forces encouraged local villagers to turn in as many people as they could capture. And this is what Abu Bakker and 24 other Uighurs say happened to them.
If a Pakistani or Afghan villager comes up to you with a guy he has tied up and says, "This is a terrorist, I caught him in my village," what are you going to do? Maybe he is a terrorist.
John Kiriakou was a top CIA official in Pakistan after 9/11. He says the only way to sort out the captives was to send them to Guantanamo.
We viewed it as a place where you had the luxury of time, you had a staff of linguists, And you could spend quality time with each one of these prisoners, interviewing them and getting to the bottom of each one of these stories.
Abu Bakker and the others arrived in the spring of 2002.
It was not normal to be taken somewhere in the middle of the sea and put in solitary iron cells. I figured I must have been charged with a severe crime. I was totally desperate and hopeless.
The first meeting before I went in to meet the detainee, I thought this radical jihadist, I thought he might be really disrespectful to me, or he may not even want to talk to me.
Rushan Abbas was a Uyghur from California brought into Guantanamo to translate for the interrogations of Abu Bakker and the others.
At the beginning, I felt that mission was important. I was doing something really important to help the government to sort through these people, to find out about them and make a decision. After about 6-7 months, I realized that the mission is becoming useless, especially my translations. I felt the interrogators already got what they want to know.
This hearing shall come to order.
There are no publicly available recordings of any of the Uyghur interrogations, but the Uyghurs would later answer similar questions at special hearings held in a makeshift courtroom in the camp.
Did you receive any type of training from Al-Qaeda or from Taliban?
But after months of questioning, the military became convinced of the Uyghur story that China was their foe, not the U.S.
I heard that Uyghur people in Afghanistan, they trying to fight back the Chinese government and try to get back their independence. We never fight back to U.S. forces or coalition forces.
It became clear to us who these Uyghurs were. In fact, that they were not part of the Al-Qaeda network. We decided that there were many of them that could actually be released or transferred from Guantanamo.
At the State Department, Pierre Richard Prosper would be put in charge of the Uyghur cases. For him, the Uyghurs presented a unique dilemma. The U.S. did not regard the Uyghurs as a threat, but the Chinese saw them as terrorists.
We looked into sending them back to China. And the more we examined it, the more complicated the question became. We spent years trying to find a home for them. When I left at the end of 2005, the Uyghurs were still there.
Sometimes the interrogators came only once a month, or even once every 2 months. We would end our lives there, I thought.
At this point, the Uyghurs were entering their 4th year at Guantanamo, stuck in a seemingly endless waiting game.
The interrogators lost interest in them because their story is not what they are looking for. They kept being told they are innocent, they are innocent, they are going to be released soon.
It was at this time that a Boston-based lawyer named Sabin Willett volunteered to take on their cases and was flown to Guantanamo.
We would meet our clients in a place called Camp Echo, which was an old interrogation facility, and you'd be admitted into this through a series of gates. It was hot. It was the middle of the summer. It's all gravel and then these huts. And in the back of your mind is, am I about to meet a 9/11, criminal?
But the Uyghurs' story, Willett found, was very different.
One of the things we did learn was that Abu Bakker had been cleared by the military. They weren't enemy combatants at all. But this clearance was held secret, even from the court. And the men had been sent back to the same cells they'd been in with everybody else.
Willett decided to file a petition to free Abu Bakker and 4 others who had been cleared by a military tribunal. In late 2005, Willett won a minor victory in federal court. The judge believed the Uyghurs were unlawfully detained, but he didn't believe he had the power to set them free. Willett appealed, but just a few days before the case was to be heard, he got a phone call.
It was my opposite number at the Justice Department, and he said, we're moving to dismiss your appeal. And I said, really? I said, why? And he said, because they're not there anymore. And I said, Where did they go? They swim somewhere? He said, they're in Albania. I said, Bob, where are they really?
This is when the Uighurs were put on that night flight to Tirana and driven to their new home in exile. The next day, Willett landed in Albania himself and found Abu Bakker and the others where they'd been dropped off.
I met them on Sunday. It was thrilling to be out of Gitmo. I'll never forget that reunion. It was pretty wonderful. And then the reality set in. You know, their families are in China. They're stuck in Albania. You can't, as an American, you can't look at these people in the eye and not feel embarrassed about what's happened to them.
What do you do with people that you pick up, they come into your custody, and they can't be returned home because of treatment issues? What are the options for them? And I think you find there are very few options.
Vijay Padmanabhan was the State Department lawyer who helped negotiate the release of Abu Bakker and 4 of the other Uighurs to Albania.
Albania and the United States have a very positive relationship, and I think the Albanian government made a decision, humanitarian reasons, political reasons, that it was in its interest to help the United States on this issue.
It was a marriage of convenience. After years of controversial foreign policy, the Bush administration had few friends left in the world. They turned to Albania, one of the last countries where the United States still had leverage. Albania agreed to take 5 of the 22 Guantanamo Uighurs. The following year, President Bush became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the country.
We have tried to do our best to help out with one of the aspects of the war against terror, which is the difficult situation in Guantanamo.
We asked the Albanian foreign minister, Lulzim Basha, if they took the Uighurs as part of a quid pro quo for aid.
I wouldn't say this was a trade-off. Just like our presence in Iraq, our presence in Afghanistan, this is a sign of our will and our capacity to share the responsibility in the coalition against terror.
But the Chinese weren't happy and began to pressure the Albanians to hand back the Uighurs.
阿尔巴尼亚方面呢，近日接收了5个人呐，根本不是什么难民，而是东突的恐怖嫌犯。我们认为这些嫌犯呢，理应被遣返回中国。
Not long after, the Albanian prime minister met with a Chinese delegation. He would not hand back Abu Bakker and the others, but he also wouldn't do anything more to provoke the Chinese. Despite requests, the Albanians would not take any of the 17 Uighurs remaining at Guantanamo, and neither would anyone else.
We actually have not sent Uyghur detainees from Guantanamo to any country other than Albania. Many other countries, almost every other country in the world has been approached with respect to taking Uyghur detainees, but no one has actually agreed to take them.
5 of us have been cleared and released, but the rest of us are still there. Now 17 Uighurs have been detained in Guantanamo for 7 years. I don't know how it came to this.
By mid-2006, the remaining Uighurs at Guantanamo had been moved to a new facility called Camp 6, modeled after a supermax prison.
The men call it the dungeon above the ground. It's total isolation in a concrete bunker. So you're in a cell alone for 22 hours in the day. You don't have a companion, you don't have a book, you don't have a television, you don't have anybody to talk to except yourself. They started to crack up. One of them used to tell me that he was starting to hear voices in his head, and we noticed that his foot would tap on the floor like this, you know, and he was shaking when we saw him.
They became more withdrawal, quiet, don't say much, don't ask that many questions, negative about everything.
Rushan Abbas had quit Guantanamo back in 2003. Now she was back as part of the Uighurs' defense. The legal team urged the Uighurs to keep pressing their case through the courts, but the remaining Uighurs had lost hope. For one detainee, the moment of choice came when conditions at the camp grew tougher, and the guards took away his bed sheet.
A few months earlier, some other prisoners had used bed sheets to commit suicide, having despaired of ever getting out of there. So he had no bed sheet. And he wanted to know in our meeting, Did we think his having brought a case was why they took away his bed sheet? And we said no, but he was a little skeptical. So we get outside the cell, and our interpreter, Rushan, says, he said to drop the case. And I said, what? I said, yeah. He said, it's not worth a bed sheet.
As president, I will close Guantanamo, reject the Military Commissions Act, and adhere to the Geneva Conventions. It is time to turn the page. It is time to write a new chapter in our response to 9/11.
President Obama has signed the order to close the camp, but hard questions remain about the fate of the prisoners still there.
You have to figure out, what do you do with the residual population, the people that we can't find a way to send home and that we can't prosecute? It's fine to say close Guantanamo, but when a senator or a congressman says, okay, well, that means the person is going to be let loose on the streets of Topeka, Kansas, they'll be opposed to actually letting that happen. So the new president's going to have to ask himself some very difficult questions.
Meanwhile, as the fate of their friends hangs in the balance, the freed Uighurs have been trying to make new lives for themselves in Albania. They've found a local mosque to attend and look to its imam for guidance on how to fit in.
Në fillim të kur jemi takuar për herë parë, e kishim qik me ndrojtje se thoshim ora në të vërtetë këto çfarë janë me fjalë. Po pastaj kur u siguruam që janë njerëz pa probleme, u hapën më shumë ata të huaj, njerëz pa njohur, nuk njohin këtë vend, domethënë, edhe ne jemi munduar domethënë të gjendemi pranë, të luajmë atë rolin e familjes, atë rolin e vëllait, atë rolin e njeriu që ato konsultohen ose vinë për konsulencë për çështje fetare dhe për çështje të tjera domethënë.
Their real families were back in China, but most of the men are resigned to never seeing them again. 2 of the Uighurs have given their wives permission to remarry, but not Abu Bakker. Not long ago, Abu Bakker's wife sent him the video of their wedding. He says he watches it to reminisce.
It's been 8 years that we are living apart, and for the past 2 years we've just exchanged simple words over the phone. We are just getting along like acquaintances.
In the fall of 2008, all of the Uighurs at Guantanamo were removed from the Pentagon's enemies list. Last month, in a gesture of goodwill, a few European countries stepped forward to say they would help resettle some Guantanamo detainees. Meanwhile, for some of the Uighurs, this will be the start of their 8th year in captivity.